Hi, I'm Alexa Ray Corriea, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook podcast. Today's episode is with Ashley Poprik and Chris Holzworth, both writers on Call of Duty Black Ops 6. For those of you following my career, I also worked on Call of Duty once upon a time, so we had a very frank and very honest conversation about what working on the franchise is like and all of the work that went into making the conspiracy theory laid in Black Ops 6. I'm not going to spoil any part of it. I felt like this conversation was just so incredible. It gets a little spicy, so please enjoy.
The Cold War is over.
My guess is that they're planning a spectacle of some kind. Something that'll scare the hell out of people.
Coalition forces launched the operation 2 weeks ago against Saddam Hussein. They're taking out as many strategic targets from the air as possible.
Do it.
Station weapon free.
It's a biological weapon. And they put this in Saddam's hands, too?
Isn't that your friend?
The nature of our enemy is unclear now.
We're not alone.
They would kill each one of you given the open shot.
Time we had a chat.
All right. So, how did you get here? What was the path for you to arrive at the year of our Lord 2024 writing Black Ops 6? Ash, you go first. What's your career been like?
It's been fast and furious, as Vin Diesel would say. So I had kind of figured out that game writing, one, was like a thing that existed, and then immediately followed like by it being my dream career while I was in my bachelor's program. And so I was doing kind of like game jams. I was in extracurricular like game dev club stuff while also getting my degree in film. So I kind of had like a mix of like some game stuff and then like some TV writing stuff. And so I was able to kind of put that together and first work as an intern at Insomniac Games, writing on Spider-Man 2. So that was like my first like actual big boy studio job. And then immediately kind of out of school, I had one semester left and I started working at a indie studio called Bonus XP, rest in peace. Yeah, I was there for a year, but just kind of like, I don't know. I can't tell if it was a gut feeling or if it was anxiety. I think it might have just been both, but I was like, something's afoot and I have a feeling this project might not see the light of day. And so, I went just kind of on the job hunt as you do sometimes. And I just happened to see an opening for High Moon Studios. It was the first time that I had heard of that studio, but when kind of researching, I was familiar with their Transformers games and also the Deadpool game that had come out, I think in like 2013. And I was like, oh, okay, sick. But I was pretty aware that it was going to be Call of Duty from there out. So, interviewed, kind of, got the job and have just been working on Call of Duty ever since. So I ended up on Black Ops 6 just because that's kind of the natural progression of things, right? I basically am attached on to every game writing team if there is one for each game. And so for this time it was Black Ops 6, which Chris and we actually were like ships passing in the night. I feel like when I was starting to fully work on Black Ops 6, that's when the layoffs happened, in which I will take that to Chris.
Yeah, I mean, if Ash's career has been fast and furious, mine has been long and laborious. I I'm showing my age a little bit here. I didn't think I could be a writer for video games, so I pursued writing about video games and journalism, and sort of wound my way up to the third phase of EGM at that point. Did a couple of years there, but at that point had realized there are, Western storytellers in video games. So I made the shift over to localization, thinking that that would be a good way to pay it back to. I got into games through Shining Force 2, Final Fantasy 6. So I joined up with Atlas and Sega and did localization for a few years, thinking that'd be a good way to get my feet wet, to get some games underneath my belt, and sort of pay back to a genre of games that made me fall in love with storytelling to begin with. Eventually, I did some contract work for a French indie studio called Game Atelier on a project called Other Skin. Saw an opening at Raven, applied. My lead liked what I was about, which was, fairly grim, dark, noir, the kind of edge he was looking for Call of Duty, and rolled onto the scene towards the end of Call of Duty Vanguard's development, and as what would come to be known as Black Ops 6 started spinning up. Fast forward to the start of this year, Microsoft lays off 1,900 people. Now I'm at Shapeshifter Games.
Wow. What did you do? Okay, so for those of you at home who aren't familiar, I worked on the 2021 Call of Duty Vanguard. So this is going to be a fun conversation. What did you do on Vanguard?
So by the time I joined up, we were a few months out from ship. So a lot of stuff, it was just sort of fixing and tweaking what was largely baked in. So Raven did the final mission, the Fourth Reich, and they did the Numa Numa Trail mission. So at that point, most of the like critical writing had been baked in. They just needed some. I think on Numa Numa Trail, I wrote some untranslated Japanese conversations. So somewhere out there's two Japanese characters having a very Kevin Smith conversation about like wanting a cigarette and not smoking in a jungle is a bad idea, and like blah 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 blah.
I remember putting your dialogue in the tool.
That was me. Yeah, I just wrote.
Oh my gosh.
Really dumb vignettes for that I knew that no one, like, unless you spoke or understood Japanese, like no one would pick up on that conversation. And then very similarly, halfway through the Fourth Reich, you're kind of working your way through a subway and there's all these, survivors hiding out from the bombardment up above. So all those conversations that people are having about like, are you okay? Oh, my leg, that stuff that was my very short and sweet contribution to Vanguard.
Yeah, those were my levels. Oh my God. I remember putting your words into the weird dialogue tool. Bougainville, Numa Numa Trail was largely written by Tochi Onyebuchi, who is an incredible novelist and writer. Shout out Tochi. I love you. I miss you. And the finale was punched up by myself and Shelby Carleton, who is still at Sledgehammer Games right now. Shout out Shelby. The Gen Z heart. That's so cool. Yeah. So we worked on some pieces together. So now you've got a lot more COD under your belt. Ash, you've been in COD for a very, very long time. COD, Call of Duty, would you say COD? Is it weird if we just call it COD for this conversation?
Hopefully people get it,
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know right now, COD is Call of Duty.
COD is Call of Duty. In your opinions, and we can have like discussions about this, for a franchise like Call of Duty that is quite old, quite storied, quite large, quite a moneymaker, quite military, what does story mean for a franchise like this?
I mean, I did the thing where you roll in with all the swagger of a new employee, and you're like, I'm going to fix Call of Duty. I'm going to elevate it to new heights. And then very quickly, the machine grinds you down and spits you back out, and you realize that for all your good intentions, there's a very hard deadline to meet and a lot of game to make in those 3 short years, if you're lucky.
3 years. Wow. That feels like a gift. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, 3 years, winky face.
For all the sameness about Call of Duty, though, there is different sub-brands do have different flavors, right? So it was for me a boon to be working on Black Ops, because Black Ops, in my mind, has always been the more personality driven of the equation. Like if Modern Warfare is the military shooter where the cool thing is to say, Tango X-Ray Delta as many times as possible in the span of 6 hours, Black Ops allows you to have characters who had a human scale existence to them. Woods might not be the most robust and interesting character out there, but in the world of Call of Duty, he has dimensionality in ways that Task Force 141 didn't. So for me, it was the opportunity to explore and examine old characters and introduce new characters and just really try to make players fall in love with the people that they're hanging out with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I was really so I had gotten off of Modern Warfare 3 to work on Black Ops 6, and it felt like a breath of fresh air almost, because I felt like I could speak like a human being again when writing. There's just so much kind of like military jargon, and for Modern Warfare, you are really having to focus on just like the mission, because that's just like the set kind of tone of the game. And I think because Black Ops, for a lot of the characters, they aren't just like Soldier 1 through Soldier 4. And so they have like actual backstories and they're affected by that. Just like how we are, like our backgrounds make us who we are. And I think because we're able to show that, it just feels a lot smoother, and it's cool because you get to actually like explore those characters. So I was very similar to Chris. I actually remember in my interview I was like, oh, it's so sad to think about, but I was like, oh, I think that Call of Duty has the potential to be better, and like I want to be the one to like help get that there, because I was the same, where I was just like, oh, I don't know how Call of Duty works, but it's kind of you make one a year, and I don't know what the past like 5 years has been, so sure. But yeah, I mean, kind of as Chris was saying, is like there's just so much work that's going in, and even when you have a 3-year dev cycle, which in Call of Duty is very rare nowadays, but there's still so much changing, and of course, like campaign is only one portion of it, right? There's also like multiplayer, and there's zombies, and there's seasonal content, and there's just so many moving pieces that there's just, it feels like there's just never any time to do much of anything ever. And the thing that I definitely learned, and Chris, I'd be interested if you kind of had the same thing, just finding ways that you can put those like human experience and like interactions, ways to just quickly inject that into the story, because there's just not time to like really be sitting and like having writers rooms where we're discussing kind of like the emotional character arcs of everybody, and it's just kind of like find ways to put that in as you're writing the actual mission,
yes,
because you're always moving fast.
I mean, we tried for sure, right? There's that brief window of pre-production where we mapped things out, we had outlines, and we had character trajectories. And then the nice thing about Black Ops since Cold War, and really the kind of the franchise since Infinite Warfare, is that they have a safe house hub, which slows things down and allows you optionally to interact with your teammates, and you can do a lot more of the character-driven storytelling that is more the bread and butter of any given writer than you can in missions. So that opportunity afforded us the window to kind of learn more about characters and have conversations that explore them in dimensionalities outside of objective-based dialogue and stuff like that. But I did try as best I could to push for... Black Ops is very much a big budget blockbuster in the leaning more towards Marvel than like,
Yeah.
Sicario kind of realm, right? So there's room for banter. There's room for characters to have this awareness of missions or to be so cool that they don't have to be under duress the same way that like Task Force 141 would be. So we tried to inject those into the missions whenever we can. I did most of the work that I did was on the third mission, Most Wanted, where you infiltrate Capital Station's black site. And that mission was very early on in development, and as a result, there's a lot of beats where it's like slowed down enough that we can have the characters sort of converse and not have to reiterate the objective because it's already been stated. So you can have them kind of quip back and forth, or you can have them reveal aspects of their personality while still tapping into the mission in terms of like, using the excuse of getting on those ridiculous American dirt bikes to reveal that Marshall is like a media junkie and is very much into movies. And you can kind of learn more about that when he has a conversation with Woods later on and talks about Captain America and Professor X and stuff like that. Like he's obviously a nerd and sort of like an authorial insert in that respect. But at the end of the day, deadlines loom, your best intentions and your greatest wishes kind of get cut down. Compromises are made, and so well-planned character arcs suddenly end earlier than you thought they would, and game development happens at the end of the day.
It's all coming back to me now too, listening to you talk. Both of you have mentioned joining the COD family, and Ash, you use the term better. I'm going to come in and make the story better. Can you elaborate on what that meant for you? And I will insert myself a little bit into this conversation as well, because I really think that this was a big idea for Vanguard as well. We kind of wanted to tell a cinematic story that kind of went beyond the idea of you are playing a first person shooter. And I think we succeeded in some regards and maybe were failed in others, not because we were all terrible writers, but because at the end of the day, the franchise is gameplay first. And also, I feel like the audience, the previous audience of this franchise comes with quite a bit of baggage. And I'm wondering if that factors into your answer when you say, oh, I want to come in and make it better. And I'm wondering if that audience baggage factored into the way that you approached writing the characters for Black Ops 6.
So, and this is just kind of from my perspective, right? But when I was growing up, I remember, I was kind of in the age group where 2012 Black Ops 2 was like, that was like peak Call of Duty for everybody that I knew. I think I was just like, I was like a little too young for the Modern Warfare wave, but like the Black Ops that just like hit at the perfect time, and it felt like everybody, including me, had Black Ops 2 and was playing it, and that was like the Call of Duty, I think, like peak. And then I would hear about it more and more, just kind of like as some other titles came. I remember when Black Ops 3 came out, I was like, oh, cool. But I also like I never bought it. I only knew a couple people who actually played all the way through. And then once it kind of hit like Ghosts and Beyond, like it was just radio silence. I was just kind of thinking about, and I feel like, a lot of people that you see online, especially, gamers, capital G, they talk a lot about just like, oh, it's not what the old games were. It's not what the old games were. And I don't think that was, I don't think that they're necessarily right or wrong. But I do see kind of like where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Because, at that time, I remember, because Black Ops 2 was also my first rated M game. And it was like, oh, like this is like me, and I'm an adult now, being 12 years old. But, I think that was like kind of the energy that everybody wanted to like emulate at that time, and it's just not the same anymore.
Mm.
We've, it's not enough just to be like, oh, this person is is badass, and what does that exactly mean to, right? I think what kind of happened is, as we kind of work in a larger and larger space as a kind of giant media conglomerate, almost corporate entertainment, um, you start kind of sanding away like the edges of what made that product like good. And I think kind
Mm.
of at the edges of everything was the kind of like the humanity of it. And so it just kind of got like so washed, trying to be like, okay, well, we just need to make the next thing and it's supposed to make you feel cool, that it just kind of stopped hitting and appealing with the players as much as it used to, because it's not just enough to be able to, do cool headshots and like flip off the back of a truck or something, right?
Yeah.
People are expecting more now, and I think some of that also kind of came with, just kind of being in the 2010s, like more of those very story heavy games just kind of gaining more popularity.
Yeah.
And so I think, I don't know, when I was interviewing and talking about it, me wanting to make it better, I think I was talking about, I want to be able to see the thing that's all rounded and shiny and polished and basically sanitized, right? And
Yeah.
be able to put kind of those little rough edges back, right? Because that's what people actually like, because that's also how we are as people. We want to have
Yeah.
characters who are flawed because we're flawed, and if they're completely perfect and they never emotionally react to anything and we don't see them develop, then it's hard for us to relate to them, right? Because I mean, shit, I'm not perfect and professional all the time. Like, you want to see characters mourning the deaths of their soldiers, and
Yeah.
kind of the people who are in those like death defying missions with them every day. And I think that um they lean so much into like, because players liked the military realism, I think they leaned so much into that they forgot that like part of realism is also the part where we're like having emotions and stuff. And so
Mm.
you don't really get to have those like big, kind of like those more like dramatic moments. If there are any jokes in between characters, like those are some of the first to get cut, right? Because it's like, well, this doesn't have anything to do with the mission or what the player needs to do. And so you're just left with basically nothing, right?
Yeah.
They're barely characters anymore. And yeah, so I was hoping that I could kind of change that. And I think with just the production of Black Ops 6, I think partially because it was all coming in so hot too, there was a lot more opportunity to kind of let personality shine. And I think that players noticed.
They definitely did. I've seen a lot of really great articles and reviews for Black Ops 6 specifically mention that the story feels like it is a return to form for the franchise, which is great because this franchise is so long and has been going on for forever. Um, and I can understand, like, with the way that you defined better, I definitely understand that. On our project, it was very much the same. We wanted to have if we were going to tell the story of, the first team ever in Call of Duty history, how they all got together, how Special Ops started, it had to be heartfelt. Like, there had to be a human reason for these people wanting to work together. And, like, of course, like, the best villain in all of history for now, well, at that time, was the Nazis. So that was an easy choice. And it was really, really just a matter of gathering all the people victimized by that group and having them tell their story and come together. That being said, for a franchise that again is so long, you've talked a little bit about, Modern Warfare. The way they speak is different than how they speak in Black Ops, and Vanguard was a World War II game, so that was also very, very different. When you are preparing to write for a Call of Duty story, where do you start? We talk a lot about ripped from the headlines and digging into history, but when you get your assignment, it's a Modern Warfare, it's a Black Ops, it's a Vanguard, it's whatever it is. Where do you start? Where do you look first before you start writing? Chris, do you want to go first?
So for Black Ops 6, we inherited, of course, the timeline, right? By setting the game in 1991, you sort of know what topics you want to talk about on a geopolitical scale, and also on a personal scale. You have Woods just coming out of having his knees blown off, and sort of being able to examine what that does to a character, and what his, here's a man who defined himself as this forever soldier, and now he's been reduced to a desk jockey effectively. Like, he's not going to go full, BJ Blazkowicz in Wolfenstein 2 and roll out there in a wheelchair capping people. That didn't stop us from getting a little short scene where he does do that in the game. But the other thing was, we had the mandate, and I don't know if that came all the way from the top or if that was just internal to Raven, to have a rogue team. So when you know that that's a component, I suppose it's a point of flattery to see a lot of people bring up this franchise. You dig deep into Mission Impossible movies and other political thrillers. And I know for me, like, if I had to point to things that were constantly a point of reference or research, it's Captain America Winter Soldier, it's Mission Impossible 3 were my two, like, North Stars while making that game, and sort of examining the tropes of those sort of political thrillers that are operating more as big budget action blockbusters than they are cerebral pieces, and seeing what can work within the confines of the story that we're telling. So to some degree, it's interesting to go back to what you mentioned in terms of the franchise sort of being left behind by a lot of other narrative-driven games that started kicking off around 2013, right? That's like BioShock Infinite, that's The Last of Us. I would say that Call of Duty kind of tilted in that direction with Infinite Warfare. For all its faults and flaws, it was a very character-driven game with memorable characters. I would maintain is one of the better, if not best, Call of Duty narratives out there, between the robot Ethan and the co-pilot Salt and stuff like that. And it feels like the franchise and then the subsequent writers were punished for the weird internet reaction to that game. And there was sort of a course correction away from that. And then enough time has passed now that we were able to kind of get halfway back up the ladder to where we ought to have been to begin with, especially coming hot off of, God of War's reboot and then The Last of Us 2. Like, there's been sort of a resurgence of narrative maturity. So being able to point to those and say, like, this is what everyone else is doing, these are new industry standards, we should be chasing that narratively, made those endeavors a little easier. And then being a two-person team initially, it was just me and my lead. I had way too much influence over a game, despite being a relatively new employee at the time. But you do get a lot of pushback as well, in terms of people who, when you look at a company like Raven and you think about their history and how they went from being an independent developer making Singularity and X-Men games and all this other stuff, to sort of being a COD support, getting a seat at the adults table, for lack of a better term, doing the campaign on Black Ops Cold War and again on Black Ops 6, there's a certain amount of, like, reluctance to rock the boat too much. So playing within those confines also sort of, like, makes life both easier and harder to reboot the narrative parameters, so to speak.
Ash, do you have anything to add to that?
This might end up being a segue, but I feel like I felt that the most, just in terms of Black Ops 6, with Harrow's mission, the kind of second to last mission.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like making that one, it felt just so different from any other Call of Duty mission that I had ever gotten to work on. I remember when I got to do like kind of the first draft of that, I was just thinking a lot about how similar it felt to when I used to do playwriting. So I used to, kind of write for the stage, right? And it felt very, very similar in terms of just kind of like the interpersonality and kind of like the viscerality of being in that headspace. You were an adult and you're kind of like age regressing almost back into the place of your biggest trauma when you were a child. And kind of similar to Chris, I was like, whoa, I get to put the big boy pants on now. And it definitely I feel like it definitely paid off, and it was one of my favorite things to work on. But then of course there was like a lot of meetings and stuff as well, just trying to like make sure that it was reined in and that it was still kind of within Call of Duty. And I think at the end of the day, I'm pretty happy with what came out of it.
It's and this is true for many franchises, but it is definitely true for Call of Duty. When you are writing your story, you are always it's gameplay first, so you're always restrained by the mechanics. For Black Ops, there were a couple of new mechanics that they introduced. Did those factor into at all the way that you were telling your story, or certain set pieces that you chose, or the way that you utilized certain characters?
You used the phrase in a interview with Alison Lors from Bungie, I think. You used the phrase Legos to describe the narrative process on a Call of Duty, and that's how I've always also described it. It's this very much like the missions are already selected in some way. They're driven by the mission designers. They dump those 12 bricks in front of you, and they're like, build a car, and you have like pieces from wildly different sets. Like there's a little bit of a space shuttle in this one, and I think that's a Duplo piece. Like, so it's very much you become a quiltist, right? Where you're building a whole out of a patchwork series of pieces. So a lot of the narrative decisions in a Call of Duty, Black Ops 6 in particular, are informed by, well, if we're going into the villain's mind, we need a good reason to go into this villain's mind. If we're going into a abandoned black site facility where you huff some hallucinogenic gas, that gas has to play a vital role. And so that sort of like, on the one hand, it backs you into a corner, right? Like you're stuck working with that Lego brick.
Sure, yeah.
But on the other hand, it helps build the armature so that you know now, like, okay, well, I have to earn this plot point and build up to it. And then this plot point has to inform the third act in a meaningful way. So we must have gone around the table discussing what our obligatory WMD would be for months on end before eventually the argument was presented like, well, it'd be weird to just have this hallucinogenic gas that means nothing. It's such a weird and wild thing to introduce in the game and then just dismiss like it's normal.
Yeah.
So that should be it in some capacity. And you sort of reverse engineer things in the same way to cite Winter Soldier again. My understanding of Marcus and McFeely's writing process on that was Kevin Feige wants to see some helicarriers falling out of the sky. Build a story that gets to this point, and that's sort of like you just sort of work your way back from there until you have something. So it's like a blessing and a curse, right?
Yeah, I feel like it's I feel like Legos is honestly a really good analogy. I always think of it as like a sandbox. They throw us into a sandbox and they gave us like, the bucket and pail, and they're like, okay, make something now. And that can definitely be really restraining for some people, but I do enjoy kind of like knowing again like where the edges of the sandbox are and like what tools I need to be using for it, because if I'm just kind of like thrown on a beach and told to do something, like it's just like it's almost like it's too much.
Yeah, it's kind of like you are flexing a different writing muscle that you don't always get, which is the massive constraints. You're essentially writing to constraints. And I've talked to a couple of indie developers on this podcast that have talked about writing to constraints and how that forces you to think about things very differently and sort of cram what you can using the Legos that you have before. So it's definitely a challenge. It's very much a challenge. I want to talk about, this is a two-part question. I want to talk about Black Ops 6 story specifically. It's very ripped from the headlines. It really plays with the idea of conspiracy theories. And I can imagine that writing something ripped from the headlines right now is very, very stressful because all the headlines are bad and the real world is kind of in a very, for lack of a better term, we are still in unprecedented times with strange things happen every day. They've told us that aliens exist and nobody batted an eyelash. Like everything is really just kind of fraught. So when you are looking at those headlines and thinking, okay, what reality do we base our story on? What headlines do we pull from that inspire us? How do you choose? How do you sift through that? And what are the pitfalls of that? And on the same side of the coin, how difficult is it writing about conspiracy theories when we live in a society now that a lot of conspiracy theories have really kind of changed people's beliefs and literally altered the course of our actual human history? That's a big question, but
I mean, we live in a time now, right, where conspiracy theories in general are someone's ideology. It's not necessarily that they subscribe to one. It's the idea that there being some sort of design behind the actions of people is more comforting than the idea that a bunch of idiots are running the show. And granted, our current political landscape is full of legitimate idiots. But when I say idiots, I mean like I'm 40 and I sometimes like it takes a minute for my brain to catch up to that idea of that I'm this old man now, right?
40's
but
not old.
I still feel like I'm faking my way through life in the same way that we're all just sort of like figuring it out as we go along. And I don't think that you ever stop figuring it out as you go along. And it's frightening to think that the people in power are the same, right? They're fallible, flawed human beings. They don't have some sort of like 4D chess mentality where they're 3 steps ahead. There's no Illuminati lurking behind. But it's comforting to think that there is this grand plan, this grand design.
Yeah.
And so when you start writing in that space, it gets a little uncomfortable. It gets uncomfortable. I was watching not the most recent Godzilla and Kong movie, but the first one where they introduced Hollow Earth theory. And I'm like, this should be so fun and dumb, but I'm uncomfortable watching this because I feel like it's validating people who legitimately think that there's a hollow earth full of like dinosaurs or something down there. Like we sort of the saturation rate has reached a point where it's not fun. And on at some point you kind of have to just pull the pen and be like, it's fiction. It's not real. We're telling stories here. If I think about to being a teenager and how many times you had to explain to your parents that like the music you listen to doesn't actually make you want to worship the devil or whatever. Like playing D&D doesn't make you become a Satanist. So in the same way, I think most people engage with fiction and realize that like nobody goes and watches John Wick and thinks, oh, I can solve all my problems if I have a gun. Like maybe one dude does, and that sucks. Especially nope.
I know. We all know what you were going to mention, and yes, we can move forward.
Ghoulish, but most people, it's the fantasy. They understand implicitly that like, hey, I'm watching this because it's the what if I could solve my problems with a gun. And when you realize like, well, I'm making a Call of Duty, and it's going to involve a lot of bombast and explosions, and it's going to tilt inevitably more Michael Bay than I'll ever want it to, but that's baked deep into the DNA. You just sort of kind of have to throw your hands up and ride that roller coaster. But it was contentious. We were looking for conspiracy theories to kind of like flirt with or wink and nod at in the same way the original Black Ops sort of like, who really killed JFK? It was you! Like,
no, yeah.
That's probably just a dude. But like a really disenfranchised dude, not secretly a CIA operation or whatever. But you want to kind of infuse a game like that with that kind of element because that's fun and interesting and it's historical in its own way. But it got to the point where I was having active conversations with my lead about like, I don't know, man. What if people play this and think that we're like turning to the camera and breaking the fourth wall and telling them they were right. You were right. It's all a lie. It's all a conspiracy. So
yeah.
Mostly what we tried to do is fabricate one, which is the plot of the game, right? It's like there was no Harrow. I would be surprised if there was a woman in the CIA in 1991, unfortunately. We're already bending the reality in some respect, that she was out in the field and had so much agency. And at that point, we were just like, well, there was no actual hallucinogenic WMDs that I'm aware of. So by fabricating a conspiracy theory, we feel a little safer. But you kind of measure that with real stuff, which is like there were shady KGB bio experiments and bio facilities that we were able to sort of like point to and say we did our homework and we kind of like are reaching into the conspiracy theory pot, but we're not grabbing what we find in there and hauling it out wholesale. You skirt the line. Can't avoid it, but it is icky in the same way that every once a year there's a shooting and it makes you feel weird to be working on a game where you're doing so much shooting. And there's about 2 weeks where I go like, I don't want to do this anymore, man. Like this isn't, and you get over it because you realize it's fantasy. It's a video game. I never took it seriously as a teen. And I don't think that most people today, outside of a vocal minority on the internet, are doing that.
Yeah.
I hope. It's all just fake, kids. We're all just making stuff up and having a good time. None of it is serious. There are no agendas. There are no ideologies that we're infusing in there outside of what, like, it was a concerted effort for me to make sure we had a more robust cast of characters that weren't just a bunch of like rough and tough white dudes.
Oh my God. There is like there's a sort of cognitive dissonance that you need to place on yourself when you're writing about these historical pieces. I know for us with Vanguard, like it was kind of easy to slot in like, oh, the secret plan for if Hitler was killed, there was someone who would take his place. Like that kind of stuff is very believable. But when you think about the like Black Ops timeline, the Modern Warfare timeline, even if we want to bring Vanguard into this too, this is like our recent, you mentioned JFK. This is our recent history. Like both of my grandparents fought in World War II. Like it's not so far away, like the Romans or whatever, that we can make something up and be like, yeah, okay, whatever, it's fantasy. It almost feels strange to be bending or playing or moving around with history when it is so recent. And I think something that players and maybe a lot of people don't understand when you're writing for games like this is you do have to sit with that discomfort when you're writing. I know the writers of Baldur's Gate 3 have talked a lot about when they're writing the Dark Urge storyline, they talk about how uncomfortable it was to write these darkest human impulses and write these terrible things, and how like you really had to go to a place, capital A, capital P place. So for a franchise like this, how do you prepare yourself to, prepare your mental health to write something like this? Like, how do you as a writer fortify yourself to tackle something with the gravitas as a rip from the headlines, conspiracy theory laden story?
I make sure that my therapy sessions are in the same time. Only half a joke.
Good.
Only half a joke. Yeah, I feel like you don't necessarily get to pick necessarily like when you could go into those headspaces, because at the end of the day, like when something has to be done, it has to be done. And, there's other disciplines who are not having to like get into that headspace to work on that work, and they need to do their stuff too. But it can definitely put you in like a very certain like headspace and mood just for like multiple days. And even my fiance notices like, oh, you're like kind of different. What happened? Like you're really like down, you're really short with your words, or like you're responding to things differently than you usually do. And it's because I'm like so in the head of like that other character. And I really have to feel for actors too who have to get into kind of like the same headspace too. A lot of them have vocalized just like how much they struggle with that. But yeah, I think really the thing, and this could be, I'm not giving it advice, this is just me and what do, but I just kind of let those emotions and thoughts wash over me while I'm creating, because I feel like that
Yeah.
is like that's the most like raw form of just that emotion and experience. And I just make sure, yeah, again, that I have basically mental health support on standby, like the day or a couple of days later, to kind of sit through and talk about it, so that I can kind of get up, because it's almost even if you're not going through like exactly what these characters have been through. Like obviously my parents were not part of the CIA and killed in front of me when I was a child, but um right, and but there's still just kind of a space that Hera goes into where she's just like, I don't really know like who I am anymore. When you kind of see like who's kind of like behind the murders, it's almost like, oh, this is how I've been able to justify kind of my actions. And it's talking a lot just kind of like about revenge, things that you do kind of when you have been put in a place of like immense pain, and trauma, and just things that people will do to kind of instead of heal, kind of get back from, or like they try to like grow above it or surround themselves with it.
Yeah.
And so I think that is something that a lot of people have been able to experience. It's just something that is given you a lot of like really intense emotional pain, something that has defined you, even from being so young all the way up,
Yeah.
and having to figure out how you navigated it, and how coming face to face with how you responded to it, can be a really hard thing, because sometimes you realize that maybe it wasn't the right decision, or you start thinking about it and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, was this how I should have quote handled my trauma, right?
Yeah.
um and being able to get into kind of to those relatable headspaces, then I make sure that my counselor is getting her pay worth of of advice.
We love therapy here. Um, I do want to bring it back around from sort of the difficult, sad part. I do want to talk about your cast of characters. Your what did you say, Chris? Like cool, tough white guys and other folks.
Yeah,
Um,
there was the so often in a Call of Duty, there's nothing but rough, tough white dudes,
yes,
right? Like,
yes,
so
yeah. I think it was Vanguard had the first like black lead in Call of Duty
I'm
history.
yeah, playable character for sure. Yeah, I
Playable,
think so.
the playable character. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, everyone. This was what was fed to me when I was hired. So I want to talk about your characters. Black Ops is, one of the through lines of the franchise, but again, it is Black Ops 6, been around for a while. How did you decide what old characters will fit your new story? So who to bring back and who to build upon versus when at what point do you look at your cast and go, oh shit, like we have to create a new character to serve this narrative purpose, to deliver this narrative message. at like, how do you determine that? How and when you use new characters and why?
Through a lot of push and pull, I'll say. There was lengthy debates about how much, we knew that we were going to include Woods in some capacity. The discussion then became how much of Woods, is he, or do we just use him to onboard and introduce people and then have him fade into the background? Can we have him get injured? Oh, well, he just come out of an injury, so maybe that's a little redundant. And at some point you want to have a character that can kind of be the support, the foundation of something in terms of familiarity, that lets you get away with more new. So Woods was an easy one to pick because he's just sort of like the franchise mascot at this point. Mason is theoretically dead. And then for Raven, it was important to introduce or reintroduce Adler because he was their original character for Black Ops Cold War. So there's a little bit of a, like, our precious baby. But again, there were lengthy conversations about how much or little of a role Adler will play. Will Adler live or die? What if people want to play him in multiplayer? We can't just kill him. Who knows? So all those different conversations happen until you kind of get to a role where we didn't want to have Adler have too much of a presence because he would then overshadow all the new characters. So that's why you see him kind of like dip out for large chunks of the story. And he's like, I'm just going to hang out in the Gulf War. You guys do your thing. And then in one of my earliest pitches, I wanted this game to be Mass Effect 2. I wanted like 10 recruitable characters, and all the missions were going to be their recruitment missions, and there was only going to be 3 main story missions or something like that.
I pitched the same thing separately. That's
really
crazy.
Yeah.
That would be so fun. I would play the shit out of a Mass Effect style Call of Duty.
I just thought it would be easier because instead of having 12 breadcrumbs that you have to keep track of, which across a 6-hour narrative, which is 3 times as long as any given movie, which it can be difficult enough to track the narrative logic of. I'm like, it's just a one done. Every mission can be in its own vacuum. We don't have to worry about it being connected and how it ties into the next mission, yada, yada, yada. We just need 3 main beats, the beginning, middle, and end of like the suicide run, so to speak. For reasons I can't begin to remember, that just didn't. We got the one. You got Sevs, the second mission. It bums me out that Felix didn't get his own. And for various degrees of like game development logistics and budgetary reasons and who knows what else, we couldn't have a huge cast of characters. So we knew it was going to be like this small, tight team. And then from there it was, well, what are your go-to tropes for a rogue team, right? Like, well, we need a master of disguise / a face. We need a tech wizard. Okay. What are interesting and different ways for those characters to be explored instead of the usual go-to ways? And I don't know why my go-to face is Face from the A team, but I'm like, well, okay, well, I don't need the perfectly handsome white guy that we've already seen. So what if it was someone of like Turkish origin? I don't know why I settled on Turkey of all things, which really makes casting an interesting challenge when you get that specific. And then for the tech wizard, I wanted to for that character for sure to bend as many Call of Duty rules as possible. And I won't go into too much detail, but I'll say that Felix is functionally the opposite of what I originally pitched in every way, like in terms of being a German dude. I had a very different person in mind for that role. But I wanted that character to be more pacifistic. I wanted someone who was not the usual, like, strong, muscle, murderous type. And even negotiating that, you get a lot of cold feet in a room full of people who don't want to rock the Call of Duty boat too much and alienate players. So then it became like, okay, well, he used to be violent, but now he's not. But you can still have fun with the character as he exists now, trying to, in a way that actually creates more interesting dynamics in terms of someone wrestling with this ghost of their past, this form of something they don't want to have. So it was very much tapping into the tropes of a rogue team, of a Mission Impossible team, subverting them where you can, and then just like questioning the, I think it's, I don't think I'll get in trouble for revealing this. Felix is what Marshall was originally. Marshall was supposed to be a German Stasi dude who had joined the US and was with Hera. They were always an item.
Yeah.
But it was the idea of like, oh, our enemies and our allies are commingling, a very Romeo and Juliet sort of flavor there. And then I don't know how the shift to Marshall being black came about, but I got really into him being from Philly and being sort of a different side of Woods' coin. Like, because Woods is also from Philly. I'm also from Philly. So I'm at this point just like, right, which I'm like, I know what it's like to be a poor loser from Philly. Let's write how many more of those can we put in the game?
Yeah.
It was just like trying to kind of write what you wanted to see within the confines of a Call of Duty. This sounds like really self-congratulatory and
no, not at all
egregious to say, but I'm like, I've seen myself in stories my entire life. So it is a priority to me to write. And again, to being from Philly, I'm used to a diverse range of friends who don't look like me. And so I try to write towards that because I don't have any hangups about not seeing myself in the lead role. If I throw a dart, I'll hit one. There's always, a white guy waiting in the wings. So it was just like, it became that. It became like, well, what are interesting areas that we haven't seen? Call of Duty always taps into a certain, the Middle Eastern rebel had become somewhat of a trope and a stereotype within Call of Duty. So I'm like, well, what are some other areas? What are some other aspects of the Cold War? Because people default to the Cold War and think it's a very Eurocentric thing, but you have Cuba and you have that the trickle down influence of the Cold War on countries that don't get the spotlight very much. So that's how someone like Sev comes along.
Yeah. Ash, do you have anything to add to that?
Sev was my favorite. I remember you and I, Chris, chatting about Sev because I think that was like the only thing we really got to talk about before we couldn't work together anymore. And I remember seeing like a character document, and this like was so exciting to me. But you described her as this as well, being like socially autistic essentially, and kind of having a little bit more like neurodivergence than other characters that we see, especially in Call of Duty. And that was something that was like so interesting and exciting for me to play with, since the second mission with the contracts with Sev was a high moon mission, getting to pitch all sorts of ways that we could kind of see that. Of course, kind of as we were talking about, a lot of the things end up not necessarily getting picked, or they don't fall into what the idea of Call of Duty is. But I think there's still kind of bits and pieces of it that does shine through, and I think I just hope to see more characters like her, and that we'll get to push that envelope even further in future projects.
Yeah. You touched on this briefly earlier about the different flavors of writing for different pieces of the game. So for Call of Duty, for anyone who is not familiar, you have your single player campaign, you have your multiplayer campaign, and then you have zombies. And then you have Warzone, which just started a couple of years ago. Warzone being kind of the newest product. And Warzone is the online PUBG chaser. Everyone has one now. So it is kind of their version of the online. And Chris, you mentioned having to be consistent with how you use these characters in single player, because if, for example, you kill someone in single player, it's like, it doesn't make any sense for them to be a multiplayer character if they're dead, right? There's kind of like the ludonarrative dissonance of like, wait a minute, I shouldn't be able to kind of play as this character.
Oh, so, but they do it.
But they do it. I know, they do it. Shout out to Vanguard that made Butcher a playable character in multiplayer after he was already the announcer. That was really fun. writing for that was a very interesting puzzle to solve. Um, yeah. So how would you describe, or how do you have to switch your brain to write for all of these different products while keeping your characterization consistent while playing into the gameplay needs of each individual one specifically?
I mean, it's what you have to do is sort of like suspend your own personal disbelief on some level.
Mm,
Like for me, multiplayer is not narrative centric. It's not to say that it can't be, but I'm
sure.
like, if I play a Call of Duty multiplayer, I'm not thinking about its narrative logic. I'm not thinking about its connections to single player. It's a sport. I'm out
Mm,
there on a team trying to, score goals, but with bullets and bodies. So it's ghoulish in its own respect. So it took a long time for me to kind of like realize that it's my job to care about the carryover from single player to multiplayer, because my default assumption is like it's just a character. They're just playing as them. Those stories aren't real. If so, then if those are canon, Woods got killed by the Scream mask dude, I think, at some point in a Warzone event, and all kinds of weird stuff happens. All your characters got killed 900 times over in some sort of horrible live, die, repeat, Edge of Tomorrow, Groundhog's Day situation. In that, if you look under the microscope too much, so what it really boils down to, and Warzone, because it's seasonal, moves at such a clip, they very much like to tap into the greatest hits. So it's like, oh, here comes Adler. We're going to brainwash him. We'll brainwash him next season too. And here comes all your favorite villains, even though they might have died, we found a loophole where they could be. So for me, it's less about the plot. And I know that there are people who exhaustively document these sort of things on public wikis, every little detail. It's more about characters. And as long as the characters are
mhm.
behaving and expressing themselves in authentic ways, I am never going to have my hand on the steering wheel to prevent some of the absurdities that will happen in Warzone. Uh, I don't even know how often the original writers are brought into those discussions. I don't think that I was for any of the plans involving Black Ops 6. So outside of the sort of like vague concern of like, "Well, people like Adler. If you kill him, you can't play as him." I'm like, yeah, you can. No
Yeah, you
one
can.
truly dies in video games and fiction these days.
Yeah.
Um, no, you just make those concessions and you just sort of write the characters so that at least they're expressing themselves and their lines sound true and they don't feel like someone else is speaking through their mouth. But you throw your hands up in terms of like the amount of content that a live service game like a battle royale or something like Destiny requires means that they're going to go full Marvel in terms of escalation, right? It's going to go from like a city is in danger, the Earth is in danger, the
Mhm.
universe is in danger, every universe is in danger, existence is in danger. Like you just get from A to Z real fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think this isn't necessarily about like single player to multiplayer, but just in general with multiplayer, it has almost like a very different psychology between the players and the characters than they do in single player. Because in single player, those characters have no idea that they're in that space. Like we're embodying them, but that is like their world, and what they're experiencing is like what's happening to them. Whereas I feel like in multiplayer, there almost seems to be a shared understanding between the player and the character that this is kind of like a game, and we're going to be basically going together and like yeah, almost doing this sport. And you know, even though they're not like, oh yes, I am, I am in a video game. Just the way that they kind of carry the situations are going to be very, very different. There's kind of more of like a playful aspect, even though those characters are going to be dying, and they kind of know that they're going to be dying because it's in some of those lines too. But it could be a little bit disorienting when you're having to think about single player where like they're in there baby, versus now you're putting them in multiplayer and they're aware a little bit that they're in multiplayer. um yeah.
it is in some respects a multiverse. If that's the healthiest way I could think of it. Like the single player is its own universe. Maybe it's the Prime, maybe it's not. To me, it's Prime. And then multiplayer and Battle Royale are just like different echoes of that, but they're not. It would be absurd, I think, to try to integrate some of those plot components into the main story, because that's how you develop a whole litany of inconsistencies, and just to incorporate that detail. Like I worked at Call of Duty and did not know where to even find the story in the Battle Royale. I was looking at wikis like everyone else, being like, I can't believe the stuff that's happening in this game.
Yeah.
When we were, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna like total aside. So
do it aside. You aside.
Oh, I was gonna say like my still one of my favorite things that I've done on Call of Duty. It wasn't even in single player, but it was actually writing Rhea Ripley's character. One of the multiplayers, and it was just like such a different way of thinking about how you write different characters, right? Especially because Rhea Ripley is a character that is in a completely separate IP, completely different company. Like I'm not worrying about WWE storylines or anything, but you have to be kind of familiar with just like who they are as a person and how they would react specifically to events that are happening in Warzone and in multiplayer. And that's going to be a very different way than when you're thinking about doing single player. Also, I just love Rhea Ripley, so it was cool hearing her have to speak words that I wrote down. It was like, checkmate.
I had a similar experience. I wrote the lines for Snoop Dogg's announcer pack for Vanguard. And so having to like watch like 10 hours of him streaming games, because he's done it before, to get his reactions to stuff. And then just like hearing him in the booth being like, wow, I wrote that, and that's coming out of Snoop Dogg's mouth. Like it's so weird when you're writing those kind of battle chatter lines for a person that exists, because it's like, I don't really have the access to ask this person, like, would you say that? Like, would you do that? You kind of just have to analyze them and then try really hard and hope for the best. But it's a really interesting experience. Speaking of I feel like we could trauma dump all day, but we'll have that discussion offline. I want to ask you a final question. What, in your experience writing for this franchise, writing for Black Ops 6, what did working on this franchise, what experience, what learning experience, what thing did you get from working on this that you could not get from working on any other franchise anywhere else? What is very unique to this franchise when you're crafting it?
For me, it was an interesting project because Black Ops, you get to do so much more than you would normally get to do in COD. In terms of, again, going back to the safe house, I'm like, oh, this is going to help me land a job working on an RPG because I'm sitting here having dialogue trees with characters. I didn't think that was going to happen in a Call of Duty, but I think I learned aggressively how, and I learned this about myself as much as other players, like not how little of an attention span people have, but like how easy it is to miss something. And particularly in a first person game where you're trying not to rip control away, you can't guarantee, if you're still chasing that Half-Life moment where like you have total freedom and maybe there's a helicopter crashing and it's really cool, but you could just be looking at, the wall over here for all that matters. Learning to write around that was a really interesting experience in terms of like, well, I need to have, there's a moment in, I don't remember what the mission got finally called, but the casino mission where Felix loses his shit and he's smashing dude's face in, and you can be looking away, like, right, you were playing a 7, you're headed right to that direction, it's like slightly off to the right, but we had to write the scene that follows that, a little safe house vignette, with the consideration that maybe people didn't see that. So specificity in the dialogue would possibly alienate players and making them think that they did miss something. So you sort of like write it in a way that people who missed it don't feel like what happened. They just assume that like, oh, I guess he got violent, and people who did see it, can fill in the blanks, can fill in that specific context. So that I remember being very stubborn about the lack of specificity hurting that character moment. I'm like, no, she should be commenting specifically about what happened and talking specifically about it. And I lost that debate, but I learned that I value that freedom for players. Particularly, I find myself more and more, despite being a narrative person, not wanting my handheld in games. I don't like. Every now and then I'll play a Dark Souls, and I'm as inscrutable as it is. I enjoy just kind of like not having the game guide me with a 17-minute long cutscene or slow me down with a forced walk and talk. And if you want to embrace that sort of design sensibility, then you have to write towards that sense of design sensibility, which is sort of a really hard balancing act between specificity and like vagary.
That's a beautiful answer. Also, you said the word forced walk and talked, and it immediately triggered me.
It is it is a understandable tool that I, again, like as a narrative person, as an avid reader, as an avid film junkie, when I play games, that's not what I'm there for. And I think it's great when you're having, those Mass Effect style conversations when you're running around the world and stuff, but it should be at your own pace. Like I think Destiny does a really good job of baking long stretches into its levels that you can move full clip, but VO is happening the entire time and you can be picking up on story, but I'm moving down the corridor left. I'm moving down the corridor right. I'm mantling over something. I'm jumping some platforms. I'm doing verbs. I'm doing action. Nothing is slowing me down, but it's slow enough of a pace in terms of like non-combat that I can still absorb content. So I wish Call of Duty could, I hope that the franchise will learn to build into its levels that runway so that you don't have to be walking at 60% speed and feeling like the whole game is holding you back because it wants to shovel its story down your throat versus let you enjoy it.
Yeah. What about you, Ash?
I'm going to have a much cheesier answer, so sorry. But I feel like it just made it very clear that if the developers have more of like an emotional tie to the game and the story, then the players are going to feel that as well. Because I feel like it was pretty night and day between Modern Warfare 3 and Black Ops 6. And it's just, it's kind of just different guidelines, right? And it can be hard for people to feel, super emotionally connected sometimes with just like a flat military sim because most of us were not in the military. And, I was seeing in contrast, just in the brainstorming meetings that we were having when people were actually excited about the project, we would have just so many more interesting ideas. And it didn't really matter that, it was just now at this point it was myself and Chris's lead. Everybody was having a chance at being a storyteller, and they were contributing as well. And you really have to get developers excited about what it is that you're making, and players are going to be able to feel it because they sure as hell can feel when developers aren't getting to actually, do what they want with it or get to like put any of themselves in it.
The argument I've always made is that people don't cosplay as Geo. They don't cosplay as an animation. They don't cosplay as a skybox. Maybe someone out there has, but they cosplay as characters. Yes. And no matter what game you're making, no matter what genre you're in, characters are king. Yeah. And, it's why I try not to get, I used to be a lot more precious about plot when I was younger, but now I realize I would rather have a simpler plot and stellar characters than I would have a convoluted plot and, paper thin characters. The characters are who you're going to carry with you after the experience. And the characters are who fans are going to discuss on Reddit for, if it's Call of Duty, weeks. If it's other games, months and years. love to meet new people who have just played God of War Ragnarok so we can talk about Odin, because that's a really weirdly divisive character that some people seem to hate. And I'm just like, that's the greatest character I've seen in a long time. What an absolute perfect shithead. That reaction is what what Ash said. If you're passionate about the characters and the characters can pop in a way that registers on a human scale, that will, what I hope Black Ops 6 will show people is like, that will leave a mark. And like you said, Alexa, there are articles out there floating around like the best parts of Black Ops 6 are just hanging out in your house, talking to people, talking to your friends and stuff like that. I think that demonstrates what I was red in the face arguing initially in my tenure at Raven. But sometimes you need to have something prove that you can't. Yeah, you can't logic your way to victory, despite the narrative inclination to like, well, everything I said makes sense. Why don't you buy my argument? People need to touch the oven and find out that it's hot. The oven's hot. Why is it hot? Because it's on.
Well, I think Black Ops 6 has gotten a really great reception for its narrative. So hopefully everything we've talked about here, this will cause everyone to look, assess, think, and here's to the evolution of that franchise. Thank you for being so vulnerable, open, and honest with me. This was an amazing conversation. I feel like we could go for hours, but we'll save the spicy talk for offline. Again, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
For sure. Thank you so much.